How's it going, everybody? I hope everybody's had a wonderful holiday. Today, it's time for me to take a step back to doing Paleo Rewind for the first time since, I don't know, 2022? I actually had to go look. No, wait, never mind. I did do 2023. Feels like it's been longer than that, though. All right, yeah, I did April in 23, and then I did November in 22. I don't know. I tend to pick this month because it's my birth month, but also I feel like a lot of the new discoveries tend to pick up for whatever reason in the latter half of the year. But what was pretty ironic was when I looked at the new publications for the month of November this year, although I couldn't have possibly predicted this, it was a big month for discoveries that are directly related to things that I have been talking about quite a bit this year. A lot of things having to do with, of all things, Triassic animals. So this is actually an excellent opportunity for me to give some updates to some of the things that I didn't get to cover in the history of the Earth, because, well, we didn't know about that stuff yet. I was going to also cover that new Arctic rhino that was discovered around this time of the year as well, since I have been covering North American rhinos quite a bit. But it turns out that was actually published at the very tail end of October, so that was part of Geoexplorers month. And before I get into November's discoveries, I want to talk for a little bit about Geoexplorers. I've been following Max and Madison on Instagram for quite a while, and I just have to say, they are some of the most fun, entertaining, and talented science communicators that I have had the privilege of meeting. I actually did get to meet them at the Sternberg Museum earlier this year. They're both really fantastic people who I would love to see grow their following here on YouTube just as much as they have on Instagram. So if you haven't yet, I'll leave a link in the description to their channel. I absolutely think that you should go check them out. And who knows, maybe one day you might even see me collaborate with them. They are, after all, fellow hunters of the White River Badlands, so I think there'd be a lot that we could talk about. But now, it's time to go back. Back to November of 2025, and back to the Triassic.
You can't be serious.
Yep, we're going back again.
Every time I get out, they keep pulling me back in!
The first discovery takes us back to a few million years before the Carnian-Peluvial event transformed Pangaea. If you remember, at this time life was going through one of the most challenging periods in Earth's history. The world was attempting to recover from the most devastating mass extinction ever, and what was left was an arid, flat land with deserts stretching across the greatest supercontinent that has ever formed. But life was still hanging on. And in May of this year, a new genus was found in southern Brazil that could actually fill a gap in our understanding. It was discovered in May, but it wasn't reported on until November, because publications take time. So we've talked a lot about the Pseudosuchians, a clade of archosaurs that have often been referred to as land crocs, or rather, one of the types of land crocs that have existed. They were the dominant carnivores all across Pangaea during the Triassic. But we have mentioned before that one branch of this clade was particularly confusing: the Pterosaurs, a group of animals that, despite having a lot of similarities to the carnivorous dinosaurs like theropods and the Herrerasaurs, they were different enough to know that these are not dinosaurs. There was always too many differences in the skeleton to put them in that clade. We knew that they were some kind of archosaur, but we couldn't figure out exactly where they fit. But with the new species Tanracuasuchus, we may be one step closer to solving this mystery. Found in the Santa Maria Formation in the Dinodontosaurus assemblage zone, and dated to around 240 million years ago. This entire formation paints a very different picture of this land in the dry, desolate time before the rains came, because we find a great deal of diversity here. This, along with another discovery that we'll get into in a little bit, pays testament to how hardy life in the Triassic truly was. Now, Tanracuasuchus was not the largest carnivore on the landscape. At about 2.5 meters long and around 60 kilograms, it was filling the mid-sized predator role. It had a nimble body and a narrow jaw, along with a slightly longer neck than some of the other land crocs that it shared its environment with. And it also shared a lot of traits with an African Pseudosuchian from Tanzania called Mandasuchus. but all of these other features seem to make it at least somewhat similar to a Pterosaur. Now, with all the continents connected at the time, it's not such a big stretch to the imagination for a terrestrial animal to be able to spread from Africa to South America. And it should be noted that even though this animal is thought to be an early Pterosaur, it's thought to not yet have evolved the upright bipedal stance that would make later members of this clade, like Pterosaurus and Smock, such a confusing Triassic enigma. This animal could serve as a missing link between some of the earlier land crocs and the group that convergently evolved a very dinosaur-like gait without actually being dinosaurs. Next up, we're going to get into kind of a twofer, because in the same week we saw 2 different discoveries from 2 different fossil sites that give us even more information about marine life in the Triassic. The first one coming from an island called Spitsbergen within the Arctic Ocean. This site turned out to be a super rich bone bed dating back to around 250 million years ago. So literally right after the Great Dying. We have known for a long time how many different groups of vertebrates moved into the coastal and marine habitats at this time. But this site gave us a really good idea of exactly how quickly the marine diversity really bounced back. In just 2 to 3 million years, we see sharks, lobe-finned fish, saltwater adapted temnospondyls, a plethora of different semi-aquatic marine reptiles along the coast, and perhaps most interestingly, a large assortment of ichthyosaurs. Some of them adapted for crushing shells and then also moving quickly into the apex predator role in their environment. Like, for the time, this was a very diverse ecosystem. Keep in mind, on land, this was the age of Lystrosaurus, where 75% of the terrestrial vertebrates left alive were this guy. But as bad as the Permian extinction was on land, it was even worse in the oceans. Life in the oceans was 96% wiped out by the Permian extinction. So it kind of makes sense that there was so many animals moving in to take up the vacant niches that were left available. And this sets the stage for the other discovery we're going to talk about in this section. A new species of Nothosaur from southwestern China, called Lijangosaurus. This partial skeleton, which was dated to around 8 to 10 million years after the start of the Triassic and the big explosion of marine life found on Spitsbergen Island, is interesting because even though it was a Nothosaur, and in fact an early Nothosaur at that, it had an extremely long neck, which is a feature that we generally think of as something that evolved in the plesiosaurs, the descendants of the Nothosaurs. And because we already know that the plesiosaurs descended from some of these more standard-looking members of this order, that means that this feature evolved twice independently from different members of this group. And if you count Tanystropheus, the long-necked reptile I've mentioned in several videos, that makes 3 separate instances of aquatic reptiles evolving this body shape around the same time, with a small head with teeth perfect for catching fish at the end of a long neck. And they were all right around the same size too, at right around 7 or 8 feet long. Now, the main difference between something like this guy and Tanystropheus is if you look at the skeleton of this one, which for the record is not even a Nothosaur at all. Its long neck is comprised of 10 cervical vertebrae. Because of this, its neck was not super flexible, at least not compared to some of these other ones. Because if you look at the neck of Lijangosaurus, its neck is comprised of 42 small vertebrae, which means that although these two animals kind of came out looking somewhat similar, they were not at all the same in a lot of ways, primarily in the way that they would have moved. And if anything, Lijangosaurus was more similar to later plesiosaurs that had insanely long and flexible necks like Elasmosaurus from the Cretaceous, which had over 70 neck vertebrae. But in the Triassic at least, there was obviously lots of ways to go fishing as a reptile. And November 2025 was a big month for increasing our understanding of that. Alright, so first we had a Triassic discovery of a land animal, then we had a few discoveries pertaining to marine life. Now it's time to get into a discovery that has to do with what was at the time one of the greatest leaps in evolution for the vertebrates. Because if you remember, the Triassic was also when we got the very first flying vertebrates, from that one branch of the archosaurs called the Avametatarsilia, which diverged into both the earliest dinosaurs and the pterosaurs. Now, we believe the ancestors of the flying reptiles were from a family of small, fleet-footed creatures called the lagarpetids, the ones that I said look like some sort of a reptilian spring hare, with species like Dromaeosaurus and Scaloromachus. Now, despite these being fairly small, lightly built animals, we actually have a couple of really nice specimens of them, including skulls that have a pretty intact brain case. And scientists were able to do in-depth scans of these brain cases to compare them to the brains of several other types of animals, like the non-avian dinosaurs, birds, several other reptiles, and the pterosaurs that we believe they gave rise to. Now, for those who don't know, even though pterosaurs and birds are both lineages of archosaurs that evolved flight, they did so completely separately, and mechanically how they managed this was very, very different. But this gave us a chance to look at how their brains evolved as they took to the air, and the results were actually pretty surprising. Now, one thing that we assumed would be pretty universal was the rapid development of the optic lobe, the region of the brain that's dedicated to processing visual information, because, you know, it's pretty important for a flyer. And that ended up being the case, but oddly enough, when we compare the brains of pterosaurs to all these other groups, besides that one similarity, the group of animals who they came out most similarly to was actually the non-avian dinosaurs. And there was actually a lot of differences between the brains of pterosaurs and birds. And perhaps even more interestingly, a lot of differences between the pterosaurs and their ancestors like Scaloromachus. So here you can see a chart that kind of compares the brain development of the two flying lineage of archosaurs and how they evolved throughout the Mesozoic. Now, for one thing, the cerebral hemisphere ends up being much larger in birds, but overall, the birds were going through a much more gradual, consistent progression, while the pterosaurs' brains seem to rapidly change after evolving flight. And I think that honestly, this is some of the most fascinating things that we can learn about any long extinct group of animals. Because if we can get an idea of how their brains were evolving, we can get a better understanding of how they interacted with their world. And this paints a picture of a group of animals that were very different from the flying animals of today. But this is also something that's going to take a lot more study to fully understand. It seems as though the pterosaurs were drastically different in almost every regard from the animals that we understand to be their ancestors. It was actually a really pleasant surprise to see how many new discoveries came out in the month of November that had to do with this time period that I've covered a lot on this channel. So much of my content has been focused on the Triassic period. So getting the chance to make this video and recap on some of the new discoveries that came out since I finished the big Triassic video earlier this year, I feel like this really gave me a chance to put a bookend on that chapter. I want to thank Edge for putting together Paleo Rewind year after year. This is such a cool project. It gives everybody a chance to get a recap of a field of science that is constantly changing. And that really is one of my favorite things about paleontology. No matter how much we learn, we are always continuing to learn more based on the new finds that are coming from within the Earth. I want to go say again to go follow Max's channel. They're some of the coolest people that I've had the opportunity to meet this year, and I've met a lot of really cool people. And now it's time for me to pass all of you back to Edge, who will be covering December tomorrow. And then stay tuned, because after that, he will be uploading a supercut of all 12 parts to his channel. Happy New Year, everybody. Here's to a bunch of new discoveries in 2026.